a better song to play after the passage of Paul's conversion. It gives you a better description of what God is like. Whatever people were thinking that God would be like, Paul was coming down hard and people were harsh, and he thought it was all this obey and follow, and if you didn't, it'd be doomed. And you know, we talk about the fire of God smiting people, and even Jesus' disciples wanted to call down the fire on somebody that wouldn't believe Jesus. But this story with Paul tells us that it's a mercy. He's a merciful God. His grace is amazing. And when the passage where it says something like scales fell off his eyes, I could see. His chains were gone. He was driven for the Lord, but like that puzzle with the kids, it was so incomplete. With opened eyes and then spending some time with the other disciples, Paul was redirected to something really great. And that's the first mini-series. But today's passage that I'm going to read is from another part of the Easter story. It's from Luke 24, 13 through 35. Jesus appears to the believers traveling on the road. Now that same day, this would be Easter, they were going to the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they had talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up to them and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still. Their faces were downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one who was visiting Jerusalem who does not know these things that have happened in the last couple of days?" "What things?" Jesus asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen visions of angels who had said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish are you, and how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost gone." So he went in with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread. He gave thanks and broke it and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And then he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and all those that were assembled with them together and saying, it's true, the Lord has risen." And he had appeared to Simon. Then the two told them what happened to them on the way and how Jesus was recognized with them in the breaking of the bread. It's the word of God for the people of God. You know, the secret of this passage is probably that we should probably take a walk along with them to see just how weary they were, because in reality, we've all been there, haven't we? Weary travelers. They've experienced a roller coaster weekend or a long weekend. It was supposed to be a holiday. There was triumphal entrance of Jesus coming into the city, hosannas, everything turned sour, crucifixion. That's pretty wild. And then they probably couldn't take it, and they're heading home on a path. 7 miles, walk everywhere. Everywhere is walking for those people. Now, what's so special about this town of Emmaus? It's just a little village nearby. Excuse me. And Emmaus could be anywhere. It's one of those places where they can't stand. Some of the disciples, the core group maybe stayed there, but the other followers, we've had enough. We're going home. And like anything else that we experienced, it didn't go as well as we thought or had hoped. We talk, we tear it apart, we analyze, we debrief. And we go over and over and over again in our heads. Do we ever get answers? Rarely. But on the other hand, we seem to have a need to just work it out. There's an emptiness. When you have expectations, you have hope, and then it doesn't come out. There's a certain amount of emptiness. And then you go find your Emmaus, your little place, silence of happy spot, as some people call it. You go hide, maybe a camp, maybe a nice walk in a piece of woods, wherever you try to find yourself. And that's kind of what Emmaus represents right now for them. And but the problem is you really can't hide when it comes to God, now is it? We don't really expect and understand the presence. This story is not just a story in the Easter line of ups and downs and roller coasters. It's about God's presence with us. It's about the witness. And then it's about resurrection living afterwards. How did they respond? Like I told the kids, they didn't just stay put. They ran as much as they could back to Emmaus. Anything you can know about the history is Jerusalem's up on a hill. Everywhere else is downhill. So walking home was drudgery and stuff, but it was still downhill. For them to run back to run back to Jerusalem and see the disciples, that's uphill. How many times do we witness things like this on the road, doing our daily routines, shopping or working at work? Do we experience troubles and we go over it with folks, or we experience other people in trouble and they're going on? You're in the shopping line and you hear everybody else going over their woes, and you go, been there, done that. But you don't want to get involved. You got to understand that Jesus is already there amongst you. You know, Cleopas had not planned for this to be a sacred moment. Him and his friends were just hashing it out. They were just going back to hide. They were doing the things we're told not to do in some respects. He didn't stay with a group of other believers' support. They were just heading home, tail between their legs, and reminiscing over and over everything that went wrong and dashed hopes. And the part I like is when Jesus comes up along and they don't recognize him. And yet he says, you guys have hardened hearts. You're thick. This had to happen. And so he opens the message from and they knew their older scriptures, went back from Moses all the way up and opened up their minds. You know, this is a great passage. If there was ever a passage to convince somebody they needed to be part of a Bible study, this is it. You know, some people will go in there. I said, well, I don't need all that theological highbrow stuff. Or I don't, if it's a different style, I don't want all that touchy-feely good stuff. Understand when God is present, when Jesus is present with the Spirit, it's mind, heart, and soul. The part that says, didn't our hearts be strangely warmed? Jesus was giving them biblical facts. And yet the Spirit inside them was saying, oh, there's something here. There's something here. You know, cha-ching, there's something here. That's what you get when you have a small group gathering to pray or to have Bible study or something like that. It's hard to explain. But just like them, your life isn't going to be the different. It's not going to be the same. It's going to be different. The part that gets me is recognizing the Lord in strangers and stuff like that. I decided to add this story at the last minute. Stories seem to be my strength. I was working on Walk to Emmaus is a retreat weekend for adults, and it's to call it a retreat is doing it injustice. But they also did it for the older kids, high school and above, and it was called Chrysalis, just like we did with that little butterfly chrysalis caterpillar. Each of the 3 days, you're a caterpillar, you're a chrysalis, and then you're a butterfly on Sunday. I was working on one of those. I was a background person, trustee, if you will. It was in Rutland. The girls had their weekend in Rutland, and the boys' weekend was up at the hill, and we were sharing some of our equipment and supplies, and we did some of our stuff together. And I was a runner, up and down Mendon Mountain. Getting setting up for that service that evening, a chapel service. I came down to Rutland, picked up the cross and some supplies and stuff. I was getting ready. The girls were just finishing dinner and they were going in for their first conference room thing. And so I'm getting stuff together, talking with the kitchen staff and people. And out in the hallway was a guy that looked pretty disheveled. Didn't speak a word. He mumbled a little bit. And I saw him, what looked like he was going through some of the kids' packs or something like that. And I rushed over there and said, hey, don't do it. And he's like this. He said, no, he's just looking for bottles. And I said, oh, you want empties? And he wouldn't answer me, but yeah. So I went into the kitchen. I said, hey, what are you guys doing with all your bag full of all these bottles and soda bottles and stuff? I said, there's a guy here, a street person collecting bottles. So they said, oh, wow. So they gathered it all up. I came out there and gave him that. He seemed quite appreciative of that. A nice big bag of bottles would probably be hours of walking the street. And some of the other folks in the kitchen were looking out and they were saying, well, we're cleaning up from the meal. I said, let's give him a whole meal. They put together a whole plate. They sat him down and he had a meal. And then out he went. I said, well, time's a wasting. I got to get up to Mendon, yada. And I had to kind of rush him on. And he was heading out the steps because it was the kitchen was down in the basement of the church. And getting all my stuff together, kind of keeping my eye on him, make sure he gets out. And then he just stopped and looked at us. And I just kind of touched his hand and said, good to meet you. I hope you had a good time with the meal and stuff. And off he went. So I'm back with my clipboard, my supplies, going short, and I'm in the car. And I'm blasting up the hill to Mendon, just a few miles away. May have been 7 miles, I don't know. And I'm going through, what did I forget? If anybody that's starting to get to know me, that ADD mind obsessing, and I'm going through 1,000 things at once. I've been running all day, probably running out of adrenaline. And all of a sudden, just like you were hit with a car, broadsided mentally anyways, was one of those moments. One of those moments that said, never mind all that. You are working and you're doing this and you're doing all that for these students and for the other adults. And being part of this team is great. And seeing the kids get something out of it was special. But amidst all your routines and your schedule, you took a moment and stopped. And the only words I heard were, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done it to me. Darn near drove off the road, but kept going. But the funny thing is about these little things, that was all it was. Just a little in your mind, going through your routine and your checklist, a little pause, a little thank you, if you will, whatever you've done to the least of me, you've done it for me. And then back to the routine. Just like in the passage, once they recognized Jesus, he vanished. God's presence in our lives, I mean, really close presence, is elusive, it's fleeting, and it's often on the fringes and the outlines of our senses and our perception. And it's not constant. We'd love to be constant. You can pray every morning, you can do your devotionals, go to church on Sunday and give everything else. But his presence, the extra sense of his presence, isn't constant, and it's not always predictable. But it's usually timely. God's time in his presence, usually when you need it, even when you don't know you need it. You got to learn to treasure those moments. And more importantly, you got to share those moments. Because like spiritual gifts or little aha moments like that are meant to be shared. God's spiritual gifts that he gives us are meant to be shared. That's what sacramental living, that's what resurrection living is all about. And your life won't be the same. And I took a word out of context there, sacramental moment. We did baptism last week. And we tried to tell the folks, the kids, that a sacrament is an outward sign, an outward action of something that's going on inside. And first there was baptism, and I love the fact that we're following with communion this week, because that's the other one. And I hope we do have one of those moments for us. But they're resources. The problem with our sacraments and sacramental moments, and there's so many more of those, sacramental moments are very personal and can meet you anywhere on your road to Emmaus, on your walk, if you're walking away, or if you're just getting a little tired. I got this from John a little too late. It was I would love to have put it up there. It's called Weary Traveler by Jordan St. Cyr, C-Y-R. It says, weary traveler, beat down from the storm that you have weathered, feels like the road just might go on forever. Carry on. You keep giving, but every day the world just keeps on taking. Your tired heart is on the edge of breaking. Carry on. Weary traveler, restless soul, you were never meant to walk this road alone. It'll all be worth it. So just hold on, weary traveler. You won't be weary long. That's what the sacraments are about. That's what sacramental living is about, is supporting each other. We weren't meant to walk this alone. And not everyone all the time are going to have those moments. I'll tell you one thing rough about having those close moments. When you have one, and then you don't have one for a couple of years, you begin to wonder, what am I doing wrong? They come as reminders, different stages in our lives. And it's ironic in these passages, the ones who are explaining to Jesus, well, we thought he was going to do this. He was the one that was going to do that. And we had hopes that he was going to free Israel. You see the irony in that? The irony is Jesus had something much bigger in mind. I'm going to free the whole world. And not just this one moment in time, but backwards and forwards in our time. He had given them baptism, and he had given them union and the breaking of the bread, and said, "All must be with you." That's what this sacrament. That's what sacrament means. God's plans are much larger for us, and this passage has a special meaning for me. But I would hope, as we approach communion, that it might trigger something in you, stir it away. I call them nuggets. Pack them away somewhere, so the next time you're out and about, you're in some meeting, you're doing something, you're totally caught up, you can see the presence of God in another situation. And even more important, you might see that he's calling you to get involved, because situations like that can look so messy. Life is messy. But that's where you're going to find God. That's where you're going to find the Holy Spirit. And I can't tell you how, but I can tell you that if you do respond, your life will be different. And that's the gospel. And that's the good news. Amen. Our closing